Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's Logistics Rewired Air Market, Where Do We Go From Here webinar. My name is Neel Jones Shah. I am the EVP of Airfreight Strategy and Carrier Development here at Flexport. Before we begin, I'd like to cover just a few housekeeping items, and for those of you who join these on a regular basis, they'll be a little repetitive. On your screen, you'll see a sidebar to the right of the main stage. If at any time you need assistance during the live webinar, please message us in the help chat located on the sidebar. You can also ask questions via the Q&A tab on the sidebar. We will hold a Q&A at the end of the presentation if we have time and do our best to answer as many questions as possible. So a brief legal note. So please keep in mind that all information provided in this session is based on the situation at this current time and may not be customized to your specific business requirements. We always recommend reaching out to a Flexport expert to discuss your particular situation. I introduced myself just a second ago, and I've been fortunate to talk to all of you many times in the past. So let's move right on to the agenda. So today we're going to spend about 30 minutes, and I'm going to give you an update on what's going on in the air market. We're going to start by reviewing a few of the macroeconomic headlines, and they seem to be coming in very fast and furiously. So we'll go over a few of those. We're going to quickly move into a couple of polls, and then we're going to go to the air supply side update and how the industry might respond in 2023. And then we'll wrap it up with a poll and some final thoughts. So if we move to some of the headlines in the news, and these are literally from the last 48 hours. We still haven't even had time to process the news from this morning with the inflation numbers. But overall, the headlines that seem to be, coming through is that the worst is yet to come. And for many people, 2023 will feel like a recession. The IMF just reduced their global growth rate to 2.7% for next year, compared to 3.2% for this year. Merchandise GDP was cut to 1% for 23 from a previous forecast of 3.4, which is a pretty massive cut and signals a significant slowdown in global trade. And people are feeling it in their day-to-day lives. According to a new CNN poll that was just taken this past week, 22% of Americans rate economic conditions in the country as good, with 78% calling conditions somewhat poor or very poor. And we can go on and on and on, but these are the most recent headlines, and paint a pretty negative picture, for the next 12 to 18 months. So if we move on to our first poll, given these macroeconomic conditions, we have a poll for all of you. And so, how do you see your sales materializing in 2023 versus 2022? And rather than thinking in revenue numbers, think about units sold. That's probably a more fair comparison to how your business did in 2022. So if you go over to the poll section and please vote, your input is really, really important as we move through this webinar. So we'll give everybody a couple of seconds, see the results coming in. Let's get a few more responses. Okay, great. So it looks like the majority of you, but not too significantly, are projecting business to be down. About 20% of you business the same, and a good 37% of you are quite bullish on your business for 2023, which is great to see given the headlines that we just saw on the previous page. So keeping this in mind, we're going to go to one more poll really quickly, and this poll is going to be specifically towards your air freight, needs for 2023. And so, do you tend to ship more, less, or the same amount of air freight in 2023 versus 2024? So, hopefully, we'll get the same number of people participating. And looks like it is, coming in decidedly as less air freight, which is something that I would have certainly come to which I would have expected, given the macroeconomic headlines and the fact that many of you feel your businesses may contract in 2023. In addition, with the ocean market normalizing and ocean rates coming down and transit time shortening, clearly the need to convert from ocean to air is going to be much less in 23 than 21. So really appreciate all of you who participate in these polls. This is very, very important information as we move through the webinar. So if we move on to the content, um, I'm going to focus this conversation on really the supply side, but just to set the stage, let's look at the headlines from the from the air market. And so there's a lot of conflicting sort of information that's coming to us, right? There continues to be on one side a very high demand for freighters. Air Canada, for example, has purchased two new 777 freighters and is converting 8 of their 767s into freighters. Lufthansa just placed a large freighter order, and not all for replacement. This is for growth. Air China just announced they're buying 5 new freighters. Two of the largest ocean carriers are starting their own airlines. MSC, made a big splash a few weeks ago with the announcement that they're going to be operating 4 777s next year, which are going to be operated by Atlas. And CMA, who has started their airline about a year ago, will be expanding that quite dramatically over the coming years and partnering closely with Air France KLM. So you have to juxtapose all of that news with the headwinds that we're seeing in the air cargo market. The e-commerce growth is definitely slowing, and even Amazon is taking their foot off the accelerator, flying their aircraft less, closing warehouses, consolidating, and they're not the only of the e-commerce giants that are facing similar sort of headwinds. FedEx was in the headlines a couple of weeks ago for really, really bad quarter two earnings that missed expectations widely. But more importantly, they withdrew their forecasts. And FedEx tends to be a canary in the coal mine when it comes to general macroeconomic conditions. So very concerning to see those numbers from FedEx. We've had sequential month over month decline in core air freight demand, and that continued into September as well. And then, as I mentioned before, merchandise GDP got downgraded from 3.4 to 1% for 2023, which sort of reflects directly on global trade. So, with all of these conflicting sort of headlines in the air freight news right now, you have to ask yourself, are we in for a soft landing in 2023? So if we move on to the next slide, let's talk about where we think this industry is going to go. And so to set the stage, I first want to go back to 2019 and look at average global air freight yields per kilo. Okay, now this is not meant to represent any one specific trade lane. This is meant to be a global average. So it's a really nice way of looking at how the overall market is responding. And if we go back to 2019, we see rates a little bit below $2 a kilo. And then obviously in Q2 of 2020, as COVID hit, belly capacity disappeared. The market obviously spiked, doubled very quickly in a very short time period. And then we actually saw, it drop back down, but then saw a steady increase, hitting a peak, sort of in quarter four of 2021. I think all of you remember what last year, 2021 was like, and the very high rates and the very tight capacity situation. But since then, we have seen rates come down on a global average quite significantly, and load factors are dropping. And so where we go from here, really depends on, 4 key questions. How is demand going to develop in 2023? And all of you gave a little bit of an indication of that in the polls that we released at the beginning of this webinar. Is there going to be a continued appetite for the heavy growth of freighters that we've seen over the past 2 years? And so we have to really ask ourselves, are they going to be in demand? How quickly will belly capacity return? We know we're back to full capacity in the transatlantic, and in fact, next year's schedules show that the airlines will be operating at 20% above 2019 levels in the transatlantic. But how quickly will belly capacity return to other markets like Asia? And then, the million dollar question I think is most important for all of you is how are yields going to react? In this sort of unstable demand and supply environment. So if we move on to the next slide, um, so there are a number of different factors that are going to, it's going to be a bit of a tug of war on the demand and the supply side in terms of what sort of demand growth are we going to see and how is the supply side going to react to that. So first on the demand side, right? We still have GDP growing on a global basis. We're not going negative. Growth is slowing down, but the world economy still continues to grow, which is a positive for air freight in general. We still have pretty good e-commerce growth, albeit slowing, but cross-border e-commerce continues to grow at a very, very strong rate. And that typically is 100% air freight and continues to grow at a very good rate. On the counter to that, we have a slowdown in globalization. The trade wars, between China and the U.S. had an impact on this. Long supply chains, during COVID, certainly had an impact as people look to shift manufacturing closer to where their demand is. All of these impacts are slowing down globalization a bit. The modal shift is likely not to happen in 2023. The ocean to air conversion simply won't be there. And then, we anticipate regional capacity constraints, still having, less capacity in certain markets just due to health requirements, continued COVID regulations, et cetera. So we have some factors working for demand growth and others working against it. Now, on the capacity side, we have similar sort of push and pull. We have a lot of freighters that have been ordered over the COVID period, right? The airlines were in a boom period; they placed orders, but orders typically come 2 to 4 years after the strongest demand. So these deliveries still have yet to materialize. Demand for conversions, that's passenger to freighter conversions, is at its highest level ever and we delivered almost 188 conversions in 20 last year versus 2019. How is this going to continue going forward, and how will a weakening market play into the conversion market? Then, we have the issue of retirements. Freighter retirements are at the lowest level ever, and freighter utilization rates are falling actually quite dramatically. And so those are two factors working sort of against an increase in capacity. And then, of course, we have belly capacity that's recovering, and we would certainly expect bellies to continue to take some share for freighters. So what I would like to do, we can spend hours debating the demand side of this, and we don't have enough time on the webinar to do that. What I want to do is focus on the supply side of this equation. I don't think we spend as much time in these webinars talking about the supply side. So if we move on to the next slide, let's focus on where we think supply is going to go, not only next year, but over the course of the next several years. I think first, to set the stage, if we look at freighter capacity, it has been increasing at its highest rate over the last 20 years. The growth has been phenomenal. And we all know why that is because the belly capacity disappeared. It used to represent 50% of global capacity. It disappeared overnight. And so freighters had to fill the void. And so we had 6% growth. It would have actually been, much more significant than that. But over the past year, we had all of Russian operated aircraft, permanently removed from the market. So that's why we had flat growth from 21 to 22. Other than that, we would have probably been up closer to 8% on a per annum basis. So freighter growth is very strong. And I think it's very clear why that is. So if we move on, and so what's going to happen to this growth, right, in capacity, particularly in freighter capacity, going forward. Now, what I mentioned before, right, is that typically it takes a couple of years after we have peak demand for freighter deliveries to start materializing. And so we had peak demand in 2021. So we do have quite a few freighters that are set to be delivered over the course of the next couple of years. And so, that is going to have an impact on increasing capacity. But if we move on to the next slide, we've also had a massive order for conversions because on the new freighter side, there's only one really production freighter that's available for sale, and that's the 777 freighter. The 747 freighter has now ended its production run. The last two airplanes are being delivered over the course of the next few weeks, and then that production line is shut down. And so airlines have had to turn to the conversion market to fill the void. And as you can see from this slide, in 2022, we had the most freighter conversions that we've ever had, 188. Now, the vast majority of these are for narrow body freighters, 737-800 variants that are really fueling regional e-commerce deliveries. You think about the businesses booming in China, Latin America, here in the US and Europe. So that has created a large demand for the narrow body freighters. On the wide body front, it's still limited, but we do have a massive conversion program with the 777 that's due to hit the market in 23 and 24. And still yet to be seen how that aircraft is going to perform, but there's a lot of excitement, for that airplane to see if it can fill the void, going forward. However, given the headwinds that we're facing on the demand side, and if we can move to the next slide. However, given the headwinds that we're facing on the demand side, it remains to be seen how airlines are going to deal with retirements. And as you would suspect, right, during COVID, airlines were trying to keep every airplane they could operating. Anything that could fly was being and was airworthy, was in the skies generating revenue. And so we had record low retirements over the past couple of years because airlines just kept airplanes that are past their sort of useful life. They kept them going. But now, as we're at this inflection point in the industry, the demand is slowing, yields are coming down. There's going to be a lot more impetus on airlines to begin retiring these aircraft, and particularly as they come up for engine checks and heavy maintenance checks on their fuselage and landing gear, it's very likely that these aircraft retire. And if you look at this, there are over 500 aircraft that are over 30 years of age. That's a record number. We've never had that high a number. And so it's a very quick lever that the airlines can pull to take capacity out should the demand environment not live up to their expectations. And then if we move to the next slide, another very important criteria here is also utilization rates. Utilization is very important. It's a very important gauge in terms of how profitably a fleet is for the airlines that are operating it. And if we go back to 2019 and we look at utilization rates, and remember, 2019 wasn't a great year in air freight. It's actually a very, very difficult year. We've actually now fallen back to utilization rates that are very similar to what we had back in 2019. And this is across the board. And in fact, on the narrow body front with the small freighters, that utilization has even fallen well below 2019. And that's partly because we saw such an influx of narrow body freighters over the past few years. So we probably have a glut of these in the market. But even on the wide body side, utilization rates have come down rather dramatically. And so if these rates fall much further, airlines are going to be forced to, retire aircraft or mothball them, for the next time they might need them. So this is a very, very important number to keep keep watch of, as we go through the next few quarters. So if we move on to the next slide. Now, on the belly capacity side, we know that the recovery has been incredibly uneven. I think this chart says it all, right? The green represents areas that are performing better than 2019, and the darker, orange to red colors represent where we're well behind 2019. And you can see very clearly that in most of the world we've recovered. In Asia, we're far, far behind. In fact, the belly capacity between Asia and North America is still down 70% versus 2019. That's a significant impact, and is what has kept all of these freighters in business over the past couple of years. However, we are anticipating that capacity is going to start coming back, and actually quite significantly, in the Transpac over the next 12 months, particularly as COVID policies are loosened and quarantines are eliminated. Just this past month, Japan has lifted its quarantine and its ban on tourist travel. And so there's a flood of demand going into Japan, for example. And Hong Kong has reopened, albeit not fully. There still is there still are quite a few requirements for people visiting Hong Kong, but it's much less than what we had before. And so, there are also big campaigns in countries across Asia to invite and welcome not only tourists, but business travelers back. And so you have airlines now responding by increasing schedules, announcing quite a bit of new capacity between both Asia and the US and Asia and Europe. And so this capacity influx is also something we need to keep an eye on because, airlines are very concerned to get into an overcapacity situation because we all know that if demand is anemic and capacity keeps up, well ahead of demand, then, you would expect yields will follow and continue to trend down. Now, why this is an issue, and let's move on to the next slide, please. And and so, before I get to some of the conclusions of all the slides I presented, I want to ask sort of a true-false question to all of you. I'm really looking forward to your honest answer here. So, if we go to the next poll, asset owners need to make a consistent ROI for the overall health of the global supply chain. Is that true or false? So, looking forward to all of you voting. So far, we don't have anybody chiming in. All right, overwhelmingly true. And I'm actually really, really glad to see the results of this poll because you're exactly right. Asset owners do need to make a healthy ROI. Oftentimes they are making capital decisions that impact their balance sheets for 25 to 30 years, um, and without a consistent outlook on their business, without consistent profitability, boardrooms and boards of directors are going to be very hesitant to make these sort of investments, not only in the multi-million-dollar aircraft, but also in ground handling, in warehouses, ground handling equipment, the technology to operate more efficiently. We all saw during the pandemic what happens when the industry grinds to a halt. What happens when we have underinvested for years in infrastructure? What happens to our supply chains? So it is very important for the industry to be healthy, and this health is very important going forward. And I think as we look back to 2019 was a very unhealthy time period for the industry. And I do hear from customers quite often that they expect that yields are going to go back to 2019 and that they want the same conditions they were getting in 2019. And I have to be honest, I don't think the airlines are in a position, to see it pan out that way. And before they were quite undisciplined when it came to capacity. And going forward, I think they've learned something over this pandemic that they need to be more disciplined with capacity, because going back to that time period is going to lead to the demise of the industry. Because without consistent profitability, this industry will face significant headwinds, in terms of its own viability. And so, if we move on just to the last slide, I'm going to leave a couple of minutes for questions, just from a conclusion standpoint. How are the airlines going to react? We are clearly in a falling demand environment. Yields are quickly deteriorating. How are the airlines going to react? Are they going to start accelerating retirements and taking older aircraft out? In all likelihood, some of that is likely to happen. And it's a very easy thing for them to do, and it's a very good and very effective short-term planning role. There are big issues around sustainability that we haven't even talked about yet. But a lot of the aircraft they're flying on the cargo side are fuel inefficient. They're four-engine aircraft emitting lots of carbon. And all of you as customers, know that sustainability is becoming a more and more important, platform for all of your own, corporate visions. And so you need to partner with people who have a similar vision as you when it comes to sustainability. And airlines know this, and they want to be carbon neutral by 2050. And so in order to do this, they have to think about the role of sustainability, the role of sustainable aviation fuels, retiring older aircraft, replacing them with much more fuel efficient newer aircraft. So that's something the industry is really pondering right now in terms of how they do that. And then finally, as I talked about before, the airlines are insistent that they make a positive ROI, and it's great to see that all of you believe that they deserve to do that as well. The feast and famine historical cycle that has gone on in this business, led us to where we got to during COVID with an industry that was heavily underinvested in, and we want to make sure that doesn't happen going forward. And so, you know, yields have to be at a level that allows everybody in the supply chain to make money. And I think the airlines, play a very key role in how that sort of transpires. And so that's my update for today. A lot of information thrown at you guys. Hope it was useful. If we do have time for a couple of questions. Let me toggle over to the Q&A to see if we have any questions. If not, you guys can also ask them after the fact, and we can make sure that we get them answered. So let me see here. Okay, so we have one question here on, is there renewed interest in older 747s? Are companies trying to bring older ones out of storage still, or convert passenger aircraft that were retired? I would say that, Eric, to your question, I think that the demand for older 747s has peaked. We don't really hear of any aircraft that are currently parked trying to be brought back into service. I would say that during the late 2020, 2021 is when we saw the peak of that. Now there's sort of a much greater impetus to retire older freighters, particularly in this fuel environment. So I would say that we've passed that time period. Susanna asked, which aircraft are no longer going to be produced? Well, the 747, which is the iconic freighter that does the bulk of long haul flying today, is actually now out of production. The last two airplanes are being built currently, will be taken by Atlas Air, and then the production line actually closes forever, and the new 777X gets built in that factory. So that it'll be an end of an era with that aircraft. There's still hundreds of them operating, and we expect them to be for the next 15 to 20 years, but they're no more being produced. Okay, here's another question. Are we seeing evidence that ocean freight volumes, which transitioned to air during the container space crunch, is going back to ocean now? Absolutely. It's a great question. And, the ocean market is normalizing. We've seen spot rates drop considerably. We know that ships are leaving with less than 100% load factor. Congestion at many ports has come down significantly. So the need to convert from ocean to air is dramatically less this year than it was last year, for sure, and might be even less in 2023. So we're seeing very few of these conversions, and in fact, we're seeing renewed interest in other products like even sea air and things like that. That are a hybrid between an ocean or an air freight solution, and we could see even some air freight migrate to a sea air solution, particularly if a particular shipper has an over inventory situation and can accept a slightly slower, transit time. And I think we have time maybe for two more quick questions. Is there normally any correlation between freighter and belly utilization, or do they trend differently? Very, very good question. Bellies and freighters are actually not created equally. And so I'll spend 1 second and talk about that. When you put a belly in a market, all of that capacity cannot be used for cargo. Obviously, there are a lot of other demands on the capacity for passenger bags. Many bellies are flown to locations that are not conducive to cargo. You can think of markets like Cancun and places like that where there isn't any cargo, but there's a lot of demand for passengers. And so, overall, when you look at it, only about 40 to 45% of belly capacity is compatible for cargo. So that's the first point. The second point is that belly load factors tend to be a little bit higher than freighter load factors, simply because there's less capacity to fill, and the freighters get quite penalized on the return trips. We still have very uneven freight flows, and so you're full from Asia to the U.S., but you're only 40% full from the U.S. back to Asia. So they trend in a very similar way, but the numbers will be slightly different. Okay. I think that's it. So, I'm glad we had a chance to answer several questions. I hope you guys enjoyed the webinar today. If you have further questions, please send them through, and we'll do our best to answer those in a timely fashion. So, just in conclusion, that's it for the webinar today. I wish you all a great day, and please tune in to the Logistics Rewired series for our next presentation that's coming up. Thank you again. Bye.